Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tom Talk on teachers helping to create more equitable schooling systems in our country. My name is Jen Horn, and I am a teacher fighting for a more equitable system of education. I currently teach at Charlottesville High School. I have been there for 13 years. Go Black Knights. And I teach English and public speaking. Before Charlottesville High School, I was in Atlanta. I taught at South Atlanta High School, Frederick Douglass High School, and Turner Middle School. I love teaching. So at the start of this flash talk, I want to let you know that there are three potentially problematic elements to my talk. Number one, I don't have any slides. I've been telling my public speaking students that in this Zoom world, don't hide behind your slide. So I'm trying to put my money where my mouth is. And you can certainly tell my students if I mess up. The number two problem, I'm white. I think that this is problematic because this forum and this initiative is about teachers leading the way to more equitable schools, schools that recognize and nurture the brilliance of their systemically marginalized populations. I don't have the experience of being one of those populations. And there is the fact that white people have forever felt okay in defining and designing the way forward for everyone. I find that problematic. And yet, the teacher workforce is 80% white women. So in order to create these equitable schools, this equitable system of education, I do need to speak up. But here's the thing, before I speak, before I am an activist, I need to actively listen. I need to listen to my Black and brown colleagues, like the amazing people on your panel today. I need to listen to the parents of my students of color who absolutely care and know what is best for their children. And most importantly, I need to listen to my students, to my brilliant, curious, amazing, systemically marginalized student populations. So I've been listening for 17 years now. And what that listening has brought me to is problematic element number three. So I told you I love teaching. I'm in it to win it. I'm a career teacher. I'm hoping to make it to like 80 and be, that teacher with the walker going down the hall and everybody's putting pennants on her walker. That said, what I would like to do is take our current system of education, current and past, and I would like to crush it. I would like to crush it, and I would like to build something better. I think there is an inherent root problem with what we're doing in education right now and what we've been doing for so long. How many of you have ever met a 2, 3, 4-year-old who does not walk around consistently and constantly saying, what's that? What's that? Why? What's that? What's that? We are curious, critically thinking individuals. Our species is where it is because of curiosity. And yet, when those same kids, those little kids walking around with questions get to me in high school, it's gone. Or it's buried deep or hidden in some secret back pocket. The questioning has stopped. And I believe that education has done that. Here's the thing. In so many of our classes, we are centering intelligence on the articulation of critical thinking. So a student may have all of those questions, but we're not centering on those questions. We're centering on your ability to write about, to read about, to memorize, to mathematically compute those questions. And those skills are important, but they're so much less meaningful if they're not attached to the student's own inquiries, if they're not attached to that critical thinking that we all are walking around this planet holding on to. And what that does is that makes those articulation skills less important, less interesting, less engaging, and it makes that critical thinking piece marginalize and maybe even die. So we have to change that up. And that's what I've been doing in my D-tracked classes at Charlottesville High School. Yes, I started the current D-tracking movement at Charlottesville High School. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how that went. So when I started at Charlottesville High School, I was thrilled and amazed by the diversity of that school. There are over 30 languages spoken in the hallways. The school is divided between, we have all sorts of races, religions, socioeconomic status. Everybody's together in those hallways, but not so in the classrooms. As you can imagine, in many tract schools, the honors classes were majority white. The general and academic classes were majority students of color. That is inequity. And that is why I started doing a lot of research on detracking. I read everything I could get my hands on. I called teachers in schools around the country where detracking is king. I pestered Carol Ann Tomlinson at UVA. And eventually, I pestered my principal. I went to my principal at the time and I said, blam, look at all of this research that I've done. This is what I would like to do. And he said, thumbs up on the initiative. Great job, pat on the back. Let's think about it for the future. So I thought about it and I enlisted more allies. Dr. Rosa Atkins generously gave me her time and listened to my spiel. I also that year taught an academic class and an honors class, exactly the same. I had scaffolding in both classes for kids who had some skills deficiencies, and I had extensions in both classes for kids who needed more complexity. But those critical thinking big questions, why we write, why our characters in our books make the choices they make, why we as humans are so beautiful and messed up at the same time, those big questions were the same across the board. And it was beautiful. It worked beautifully. And then I brought that data to my principal and I pestered him. And finally he said, okay. Jen, if you can fill a class, you can teach a class. And so I went out into the community and I shook many hands and I kissed many babies. I went to PTO meetings. I talked to guidance counselors. I talked to teachers at Buford, CHS. I went to parents' homes and really talked up this detracking thing. I talked to students and I ended up filling 2 classes. That first year of unleveled detracked English was everything I hoped it would be. And so the next year, when I went pestering and talking up detracking, I not only had my research and my convictions, I also had the feedback from my students and from my parents from that initial class. The next year, we filled 6 detract English classes. The following year, it moved into the 10th grade. This was 9th grade. The year after, 11th grade English. Currently, at Charlottesville High School, 9, 10, and 11 English are all unleveled. Our current principal, Dr. Eric Irizarry, has taken it a step further and called it the Leveled Up Initiative, wherein kids in those classes are getting honors credit. They are all being scaffolded and extended to do the most challenging honors work they can. Not only has English detract, we have detract biology, government, world languages, geometry, econ and personal finance. The school is moving. The school is moving, and it's by no means perfect. The fight continues. And I want to let you know that I intend to be a part of that fight, because I believe that this detracking process, this creating intellectual common ground via critical thinking, that's happening in my classroom, in the AP classes that are now more diverse, in our graduation rate, which has gone up, in our test scores, be they what they may, that have also gone up. That is what an equitable school looks like. So thank you very much. I am going to now introduce some fabulous, fabulous panelists who can illuminate this conversation about creating equitable schools in ways that I certainly can't. So if you would, please welcome Dr. Bernard Hairston from Albemarle County Public Schools and Dr. Abigail Amwaku Kaiser from UVA. So as a fabulous transition, because those are nice, I am going to ask both of them to answer this question. What does equitable schools mean to you? First, Dr. Harrison, what does equitable schools mean to you?
Good morning, Jen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wow, thank you for those opening remarks. I have like chills from those. I'm ready to sign up for one of your classes. Powerful stuff. So the question, what does equitable schools mean to me? First, I strongly believe that this equity term has become a buzzword in many of our schools, communities, and organizations. And it's quickly become one of those be all to the solutions that we have. So I think that it's essential for educators to frame a clear definition of equity that can be adopted and articulated throughout whatever school system you're working in. I think this allows for an examination of personal beliefs and values against an equity definition so that you can get that staff buy-in. And we must realize that the ultimate goal should be to maximize effectiveness by developing collective efficacy among staff to identify and interpret inequitable practices. So, for example, my role in Albemarle County Public Schools as an assistant superintendent, I've been actively involved with the identification and adoption of an equity mission statement that was developed after researching a work that's done through the National Equity Project. In our equity mission statement states that we will end the predictive value of race, class, gender, and special capacities on student success by working together with families and communities to ensure each student's success. So for me, this suggests that Albemarle County Public Schools must pay attention to policies, practices, and procedures that address each student and staff members' needs to reach their full academic, professional desires, social capacities, regardless of their race, economic status, gender orientation, special needs, or ethnicity. So That's my current operational meaning of equity. So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you so much. That was beautifully said. Dr. Amwako Kaiser, what do you think equitable schools means? What does that mean to you?
So I'm going to take what Dr. Harrison said, build off his definition, and show some example of what that could look like and what that looks like in my own experiences. So if we take everything that Dr. Harrison said and think about it, to me, equitable schools mean a place, an environment where all children have access to opportunities, right? So we look at giftedness, we look at curriculum that is meaningful, we look at assessments that are not biased, we look at partnerships with families that go beyond just cultural celebrations. When we talk about equitable schools, we want teachers to value and center the cultures of students and their voices. We want building leaders or district leaders who make space for this work to happen, for teachers to feel supported, that centering the experiences of their students is something that they value. We look at discipline that isn't biased or based on subjective decisions by teachers and administrators. When we look at gaps in how students are doing, we don't blame families and teachers for it. We look at other structural things that may be contributing to why students are performing in a certain way. When I think about equitable schools, I think about my own children, that I want them to be at a place where their cultures matter, who they are and what their lived experiences are folded into their daily schooling environment. And when I think about equitable schools, I think about a place where, as a Black mother, my voice matters, and that I'm not seen as someone who is threatening, and that my needs are listened to and the needs of my children are listened to.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And thank you for making it personal. I think that's incredibly important. Cool. I have a couple of questions off of that, but I'm going to continue through our planned questions and then I'll get back to those, okay? Because you guys are lighting light bulbs up in my head. Okay, Dr. Hairston, you have been in the game for a while. And so I would love for you to talk with us about how equity in schools has evolved over time.
Well, Jennifer, so this is probably not the best question to ask a Black male, a Black man. So, I mean, not surprising, my first thoughts are from a deficit mindset. You know, as I consider my application of social construction of knowledge purely from a cultural and racial lens as an African-American male in the public school system, it's generally negative with a few positives to talk about. Truly a sad state, but I attribute that to racism. So Black males are on the bottom of the US caste system. This historically has been manifested by having the highest suspension rates, among the lowest graduation rates, among the highest percentage of students identified as having special needs, and the lowest identified as being gifted. You know, as a Black male, knowing that in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that segregated facilities for what they called folks back then, colored and white, were legal. And this evolved from a very, very, very light-skinned male described as being 7/8 white and 1/8 Black, was jailed. You heard this telephone in the background. I'm sorry. Was jailed for attempting to arrive in a rail car for whites only. Now, moving forward just a little bit, 58 years later, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that those separate but equal facilities were unconstitutional, in the context of public education and educational facilities. And so if we move forward to 2020, or about 76 years after Brown versus Education, many of our classrooms, as you so describe, Jen, still are separate but unequal because of practices such as tracking. And, and this is something that, well, so right now, we should be looking at leaders such as you, Jen, as we think about this whole issue. Teacher leaders who are willing to challenge status quo thinking and systemic forms of racism. And so, as I look at you, I suddenly realize that, I have to consider like those bright lights that individuals like you bring to those deficit thinkers like myself, and to be able to shift to that asset mindset, to notice those small things that have taken us through this long journey. So thank you, Jen, for being reminded that there are some good things that are going on. Mm-hmm. So let me shift my attitude. Try to shift my attitude by restating the question, by factoring that operational definition that I shared with you earlier. Okay. And so let me restate it. How has equity in schools evolved over time by paying attention to policies, practices, and procedures that address each student and staff member's needs to develop their full academic, social, and professional capacities, regardless of their race, socioeconomic status, gender orientation, or special needs or ethnicity. So for those folks who are listening, I want to issue you a personal challenge as listeners to consider applying this definition to your own definition of equity to answer the question specific to your work environment. My advice is to work on what you can control as an individual. That's exactly what Jen did. She worked on what she could control. She could control her classroom environment. She could control the data that she decided to collect and to go back to the principal a second and possibly a third or fourth time. So start by holding yourself accountable. And this may allow for some credibility that Jen earned when she went back to her principal. So allow for some credibility to recognize what others have or have not done. And so I would say to all of our listeners, step up and be a Jen and step out or into your comfort zone. So here is an example of that asset-based shift. For that has allowed me to kind of reshift to that asset-based mindset as a Black male to the question. And this is from a personal, a local, and immediate response to the question. So in Albemarle County Public Schools, in my role as assistant superintendent, in 2010, for example, a culturally responsive teaching model began shifting the culture of the school system. We were able to develop a homegrown model that has that evolved from 4 educators receiving a certificate in culture responsive teaching in 2015 to over 140 after 5 years. And this number will exceed after this year exceed over 200, maybe 220. In 2016, an equity education policy was updated from a very philosophical statement about the intent of equity based on some commitments, general commitments by the school board to some very specific procedures to ensure equity and measurable outcomes. In 2016 and 17, a division equity table was published for documenting and monitoring indicators that present inequalities across student membership groups. In this table serves as an accountability for us to accomplish what's in writing with that equity mission statement. If we don't do something with things that are in writing, they're just words on a piece of paper. So this year, all schools will be required to develop equity tables that will have some sense of accountability measures at the school level, not just the division level. Also in 2019, an equity policy checklist was adopted as a tool to check all new and updated policies from an equity lens, a very powerful tool. In 2019, an equity report was presented to the division from the Equity Advisory Committee, which was an arm of the equity education policy that was developed in 2016. Also in 2019, an anti-racism policy was approved by the board. And in 2020, our 5th annual equity conference was held to celebrate the 63 culturally responsive teaching completers with over 300 participants in a virtual conference. Also in 2020, the entire school division is participating in a year-long book study on Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations About Race. School board members and the superintendent cabinet has already been involved in bi-weekly training sessions. So progress is slow, but there is promise. And so that's my response to that question about how equity has evolved over time from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hairston. Thank you so much, both for your kind words and for your honesty about the state of equity for our individual students, particularly Black male students, and also for your, mindset shift. That the pips, the people in power, are moving blocks to shift how we deal with culturally responsible and responsive teaching and with equity issues. So thank you for that. Dr. Kaiser, you are preparing teachers to be teacher leaders in equitable schools. I'm so sorry, Dr. Mwaku Kaiser. I'm sorry,
You're good.
That's inequitable. I'm so sorry. But how are you preparing your teachers at UVA to be these teacher leaders in equitable schools?
Thank you, Jen, for your question. And thank you, Dr. Hairston, for your thoughts on, how long it takes for this work to be truly infused across the different grades, across the different parts of a school division. At a School of Ed, some of this work also has to be seen through an institutional lens, right? And then it trickles down through all the different programs and through all the courses. And so the works of Dr. Robert Berry and Dr. Stanley Trent are some of the ways in which this work is happening at the School of Ed, where they're supporting faculty development, because the faculty are the ones who teach the folks who are going to become future teachers. And so through faculty development, they need to understand their own identities, their own positionalities, and the ways in which who they are and how they've experienced schooling informs the way they prepare teachers to become teachers. And then in my own courses, I take this approach where I have to build trust with my future teachers. This work, talking about equity, talking about anti-racism, has to be developed in a space where people feel trusted and feel the need that they can openly share and have conversations that can move this work forward. And so we begin by exploring our own backgrounds, your own racialized lens, and how that informs the things that you do, the things that you say, the way you see schooling, the way you see teaching and learning. And then through our content. So even when we're talking about standards, one of the things I try to get my students to think about is to evaluate the Virginia standards and think about who's being represented in it and who isn't and why, and what can they do as future teachers to make sure that the students that are represented in their classrooms see themselves in the standards that then inform the curriculum that they use in their classrooms. And so whether we're talking about microaggression or talking about stereotype threat, they need to see how this is an important concept for them to understand as future teachers. And then we partner with our local schools. And so Dr. Hairston shared about the Albemarle County Schools Culturally Responsive Teaching Program. And Albemarle County Schools is one of our partners, school partners. And so whether teachers are placed in someone like Katie Schutz's class or in the city schools, if they're placed in Shannon Gilligan's class, these are teachers who are doing this work. And so when our pre-service teachers are in their classrooms, they see firsthand what it looks like when you teach with equity in mind, what it looks like when you value your students' cultures. And you're able to ask these mentor teachers who are able to guide them and help them think about it. And when they're not placed in classrooms where teachers are centering this work in their practice, when they come back to our classrooms or when they come back to my classroom, this is when we unpack what you're seeing, what you're hearing, and make connections to some of the things, some of the more theoretical or literature that we might be reading in the classroom and say, well, what does this mean for what you're going to be as a teacher? How do you take what you're seeing? How do you take what we're reading in the classroom and make sense of all of that? And I think one of the last points for folks who are going to be novice teachers, it's really important for them to see themselves as and Dr. Hairston, you made this point also, as that they can be change agents in your own classroom, And Jen, you're an example of what that looks like. Your classroom is your space that you can actually make change, and that being a teacher leader doesn't always mean having a formal leadership role. That in fact, you can take an informal role and make those concrete changes happen in your own classroom.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I feel lucky that there are future teachers going through your classroom. I feel lucky because I'm in all of this, and in Dr. Hairston's programs, I feel like, I don't know. I always think that our students and the work that you're doing is creating a light at the end of the tunnel, and that we just have to keep it from collapsing on them. Like, go, move. So thank you. That's really beautiful. Putting it to, there was a question from the audience. So I'm going to, it's actually something I'm going to address, but you're welcome to bump in there before we move to the next question. And it's just about basically how detracking works. How does it work having schools, having students of all different skill sets in the same room together? So like I said in my talk, I center everything on the big, essential, critical understandings from why we are, for example, if I'm teaching punctuation, I'm going to talk with the class about how and why rhythm is important in the written word, because punctuation is just rhythm. And we'll talk about rhythm in music, and those conversations are lively and they're deep and they're good for the kid who is smarter than I am. And every year, I've got those kids in my class. And then the kids who are struggling with reading and writing, those big questions are so valuable. So we start there. And what happens is I then have multi-tiered assignments. So there are assignments that are not quantitatively more. It's not like kids who are at a higher skill level are going to do more work, but they're going to do more complex work that is challenging to them. And kids who are struggling skills-wise are going to do the same amount of work, but it's going to be more tailored to challenge them where they are skills-wise. And remember, like, we're keeping at the center these big questions. So for example, a text I love to study, I try to do new texts every year, but I really love to study Dr. King's Letter from Birmingham Jail. I think that is one of the best pieces of literature. It's one of my favorites. And that's a very complex piece. So for my kids who struggle with reading, I have an audio version. I have broken down the allusions in the piece. We have some vocabulary work. And then for the kids who need extension, I have a congressional report on natural law that they can tie in. So there's any number of ways that you can meet the kids where they are skills wise. That's really not too hard. But what you're getting in a detract, unleveled, leveled up class is you have a diverse population of people addressing those big questions. And that's what the world looks like. That's the world. It's not only empowering our students, all of them, it is giving our students an idea of what the world is like, because the world is not homogenous. God, no. And if you think it is, you're living in the wrong place. So that's how I detract. And it's been working pretty darn well. Okay. But I'm going to move on. If you have more questions about detracting, hit me up at Charlottesville High School's email. I'm happy. I geek out talking about it. I tell you what. Okay. But hey, I want to move on. I have a question for both of you. Could you please tell me how culture, race, and equity factor into the role of teacher leaders? How are these things important as we create and support our teacher leaders? Dr. Hairston?
Certainly, I think that's a really good question to consider. And I would say that this is a complex yet very simple question to unpack. A simple response would be by modeling high expectations, like you talked as an individual teacher, and modeling those high expectations in their classrooms and buildings that can be aligned to individual student growth, always focusing on the individual student growth. And a key is understanding how culture and racial communication gaps between the teacher and the student affects relationships that ultimately impact achievement. The complexity is how we retrain ourselves. And I think that you address the need to retrain yourself as a teacher in answering that detracting question. So the complexity is how we retrain ourselves as teacher leaders to place as much emphasis on the humanistic side of education as we focus on being experts in the curriculum. So I would encourage teacher leaders to think critically about how race and culture are embedded in systemic structures that appear to advantage white students and white students. So, for example, we've talked about the Albemarle County Public Schools culture-responsive teaching model. It's described as a homegrown evidence-based initiative because it was built by teacher leaders in Albemarle County Public Schools. It was personalized to our school environment. So the teachers were a part of developing the curriculum, which drives the professional development, which drives a very rigorous assessment component. And it definitely has been a very slow cultural shift in our school division, but effective. The research, the curriculum, and the professional development have all been a continuous development process since 2010. The evidence-based or assessment components were not introduced until 2015. A certification is awarded to educators who show evidence in their personal growth on the three characteristics or the foundation of culturally responsive teaching, which then establishes the foundation for the curriculum that's developed, the professional development training that's delivered, and what validates the teacher to student growth. Simple but complex. it is really a process of reteaching teachers to focus on that humanistic value of reaching all students first to effectively teach them. And so here's an example of confronting racism and equity to empower teacher leaders as being modeled through our anti-racism policy that was approved by the school board recently in 2019, as I suggested. The policy includes strong language that personal and institutional racism have historically existed and continues to exist in Albemarle County Public Schools. It states that combating racism in our schools is a legal and moral imperative. Language that states this policy's purpose is to eliminate all forms of racism in the division in conjunction with related board policies. This language also directs that all school board members and division staff shall be trained about racism and how racism produces inequitable practices and outcomes. So, this is a powerful message that's being sent through a policy. So when teacher leaders see their principals, their superintendents, and school board members taking extra steps to become equity agents of change, they feel empowered to push and to pull harder to interrupt those inequitable practices, to examine those biases that Abigail talked about, and to create inclusive multicultural school environments for both staff and students. Sometimes as we're talking about these equity issues, we leave out the impact that racism and racism has on staff members. So thank you for allowing me to share my current thinking and doing around culture, race, and equity that can help our teacher leaders to evolve.
Thank you. That was, I don't know. I'm an optimist, but that made me feel even more optimistic. Thank you. I love that those moves are being made in Albemarle County. Dr. Kaiser, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry because I knew Brian before I knew you. I'm sorry. Dr. Amaku Kaiser, I'm so sorry. Could you please talk about how culture, race, and equity factor into the role of teacher leaders and how you are preparing your teacher leaders to deal with those things?
Yeah, so Jen, thank you for that question. And you really just call me Abigail.
Okay.
I want to start with this question though by pointing and noting that race, ethnicity, culture really informs everything. It informs your lived experiences, and which in turn informs your perspectives, right? And the way you see children and the way you see communities and curriculum. And so as a Black female immigrant, multilingual mother, the way I see teaching and being a teacher leader is very different from the way another Black female who's a non-immigrant will see leadership, or another white male or a Latinx person might see teaching and learning and leadership. But I want to use this time or this space to also highlight some of the work that African American Teaching Fellows the work that they do to build Black teacher leaders. So Dr. Hairston was actually on the board when I joined ATF a long time ago. I think it was 2004, 2005. And how an organization like African American Teaching Fellows, what they've done to develop people like me to see myself in this role. And also not just me, others like Nicole and Tamara and Marion, who all practice what it means to be a teacher leader in multiple different spaces. And how when we think about teacher leadership, and we look at the small population of Black teachers that exist in our schools, but the power in having a Black teacher, and not just a Black teacher, but also Black teachers who practice leadership and center this work in their classrooms, or as part of their PLC teams, or as part of the building level leaders. There's a lot that other teachers can learn from those experiences, and why we need to keep supporting programs like ATF because of what they do for people like me to see ourselves. Because if you think about it, you think about equity, you think about racism, and the way it starts at a very young age, and how as people of color, Black people, people from marginalized communities, and as a former elementary classroom teacher, how I have seen this firsthand, how this starts at an early age and how you begin to internalize this. And as you progress through school, you know, you don't always see yourself as a leader because of the messaging that is sent to you. And so to get to a place where you become a teacher and want to affect change in your classrooms, it takes a lot to gain that strength to be able to do it. But I also want to note that they're also allies, right? And so someone like a personal close teacher friend of mine, who's one of my best friends, Rachel Savoy Caldwell, is another teacher who has been a white ally, and she understands the work that she has to do as a teacher leader to support other teachers who are doing this work, other Black teachers, other white teachers. And that education piece is key for yourself as the teacher to be able to move this work forward.
Okay, thank you. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And I like that last part that where you were talking about how you have to link up with people. That's going to play really well into this last. I'm going to combine our last two questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question for you about why it is so hard, even though we are voicing that the desire to make equity happen is there. Why is it so hard for teacher leaders to challenge a status quo like tracking that's been proved time and again to be inequitable? Why is that so hard? That's the first part of my question. And then the second part, I'm going to use something you said, Dr. Hairston. How can we, through collective efficacy, make it not as hard? How can we, A, why is it so hard? And B, how can we, through our collective efficacy, alleviate some of that struggle? Okay. Dr. Kaiser, you're here, so why don't you start?
I'll start by honoring Maya Angelou and her work. And she says, one of her quotes that I really love says, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. When we think about this work and why it's so hard for a lot of us to move the needle, I think sometimes we think about it through our own lens and our own space, which is important. It's at the core of this. You have to learn to do this work yourself before you can open it up to others. But we have to tackle this work through multiple angles, from structurally to institutionally to interpersonally to our own individual selves, and look to see how as individuals, when someone is experiencing resistance, like when you started this work in your own classroom space and you're experiencing resistance, how did this idea of collective efficacy, how can a colleague form an ally with you and then to move this work forward? How then do you, once you have that core group, do you begin to make changes in policies? So some of the work that Dr. Harrison has described that has happened in Albemarle County schools, policy is one of those spaces that we need to think about when we want to dismantle the inequities that exist in schools. Because those policies, even though they're those higher level ideas, they inform the day-to-day practices the teachers partake in the classroom. They inform the way families see school. They inform the way children experience schools. And so I think that this work moves forward when we can address it from all different angles.
Thank you very much. I agree 100%. Dr. Hairston?
So yeah, I agree with everything that Abigail said. Collective efficacy is so important to us being on the same page and working as from small groups to larger groups to shift cultural mindsets. But in my conversations with colleagues, and this is more specific to the status quo question. In conversations with some of my colleagues, they may hear me say pop in the middle of the dialogue. This is an indication that, in my opinion, they are practicing, they're being protectors of a practice. Okay, a pop, a status quo way of thinking to protect structures that may have worked for them as students or as teachers. And so the pop response is designed to remind them to consider if the approach that they're suggesting is working from an equity lens that places value on culture, race, socioeconomic, or gender groups to ensure high outcomes based on equity. And so we have to be constantly reminded that, we repeat mistakes over and over again because that's what we know and that's what we do and that's what's comfortable for us. So it's hard for teacher leaders to feel comfortable pushing against status quo thinking for the fear of acceptance by their colleagues, acceptance by some parents, and even employment loss if they are not secure of self and grounded into certain non-negotiable principles. Okay, you have to decide for yourself what's worth fighting for. Okay, and standing up to those. Those are non-negotiable principles that you have as an individual. So we've talked a lot about this culture responsive teaching model. So as an example, when we first started rolling out this model, it was not fully and still not fully endorsed by many education leaders in Albemarle County Public Schools. I would hear comments such as, "Oh, it's not a research proven program," and I accepted that as a white talk status quo. Okay, a pop. So that's just for me yet another pop leadership mentality. While our students were continued to fail and described as subgroups by the same voices. To me, a valid message of a pop. That's a subgroup. And a subgroup is, and in my opinion, unmistakable racial and cultural put down. A protector of that caste system that I mentioned on the front end of being an African-American male that categorizes people based on a structure of privilege. So, so if you tell me as a teacher that I'm brilliant, you might build my confidence. But if you constantly refer to me as less smart, you might get mistrust. So membership groups is more of a culturally responsive description of, from an equity-minded educator to consider. And so, we have to pay attention to those small things if we are going to consider ourselves as equity leaders.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hairston. And I'm just going to bag what I was going to say at the end because we're almost out of time. And I'm just going to encourage everybody who is listening, be you a community member who works in a different profession, or a teacher or administrator or educator or division head, please remember pop, because that's the way we should pop ourselves every day. Like, you should recognize the pop in yourself and pop other people, and then maybe this more equitable system of education will become whole. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. You guys were amazing, and you buoyed me up. I'm sure you buoyed everyone up. I'm going to turn it back to Ben, and he's going to have some parting remarks.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you, Dr. Hairston and Dr. Mwaka-Kaiser, for the wonderful insights and experiences that you shared with us today, and for that call to action. I think the pop is something we can all remember and put into place. I just wanted to remind everyone that we have one more panel conversation in what has been an incredible series of conversations around equity in K through 12 education. That's at 4 p.m. today. The title is Equity Through Inclusion, Embracing Cultural and Linguistic Diversity. So we encourage you all to be there. There's some fantastic student leaders as well as state level folks that are going to be speaking and sharing with us. We would like to thank the UVA School of Education and Human Development for their support and collaboration in building this program. And we'd also like to remind you that all Cities Rising events are pay what you can, thanks to the support of our sponsors and community members like you. So if you enjoyed today's program, we'd encourage you to become a contributing member to the foundation. And with that, thank you all again for being here and for sharing. Thank you to our panelists and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.